This is Mobilizing Social Ecology, exploring ecological and democratic transformations for collective liberation and life-sustaining worlds. Welcome to Mobilizing Social Ecology, a podcast of the Transnational Institute of Social Ecology. I'm Krini, and my co-host today is Yavor. We're both from the Institute, and we're joined by Eleanor Finley. Eleanor is a public anthropologist who has been directly engaged with radical democracy movements for over 15 years. She was born and raised in the suburbs outside Washington, D.C., where she first got involved in radical anarchist and anti-globalization movements. She studied philosophy at Virginia Commonwealth University and later was involved in Occupy Wall Street in New York City. After Occupy, Eleanor pursued anthropology at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, conducting ethnographic research on anti-extraction and climate justice movements in Catalonia and the Basque Country. At the same time, she was an educator and organizer at the Institute for Social Ecology, founded by philosopher Bookchin. Her doctoral work examines the role of assembly politics among Kurdish liberation activists in Germany and the UK. Eleanor completed her doctorate this year and just published her first book, Practicing Social Ecology, From Bookchin to Rojava and Beyond with Pluto Press. Eleanor, it's great to have you on the podcast. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
I'd like to first start by asking you a bit about the book. I really enjoyed it, and I thought it did such a great job of showing what is at the core of the project of social ecology and how it isn't just about assemblies, which is what some people think, but really about new modes of relating, new ways of life, and as you put it, weaving a new social fabric. Could you tell us a bit more about the book and what inspired you to write it?
Yeah. So I wrote this book like a lot of folks write books, which is to say that I wanted to see this book in the world. I was giving talks about social ecology. I'd written a number of articles about social ecology. And I found in my daily life that I wanted to share these ideas with people, particularly friends or coworkers who had no background in these ideas or even revolutionary theory at all. And I found myself sort of over and over again explaining the bare bones of the ideas and then getting into the experiments that people have done around the world for those ideas. I often found that the first question that people had for me was, okay, well, these ideas sound great, but have you ever seen them in practice? So I really wanted something that I could just hand someone, like Marx's little book, not Marx's little book, the little red book, right? That you can just hand someone and say, here are the basic contours of these ideas, and then here's how people are practicing them in the world. This is what's going on today. And so that's sort of how the book came together. The other thing I'll say for now about how I came up with the idea for this book was that I wanted to write something that people could read without having an advanced degree, or a history and background in philosophy or sociology. I have a very close relationship with my mom, and she's someone who has an associate degree in computer science, but she never went to graduate school. But she's very, very smart and really cares about the natural world, and she taught me that. And so I wanted to write something that my mom could read, and that folks like her could read. And I found that many of the students that I encountered in my graduate work were in a similar position of not, necessarily being able to sit down with an 800-page book right away, but were very eager for something written in plain English. So I know I didn't succeed all of the time in writing a popular book, but that was another motivation for me, was wanting to see something that people could access a little more broadly.
So, one thing I found really interesting about it is that you actually make the connection between many different practices that are currently being used to cultivate an ecological consciousness, for example, permaculture, right? And kind of show how that really does promote the goals of social ecology. And I'm not sure that people make those connections. I'm not sure that those connections have been made. Also, for example, sustainable organizing, which is what I do, I find it really close. There are many different overlaps because that also focuses on trying to create to cultivate an ecological consciousness, and it involves kind of rethinking and re-experiencing connections in a different way to nature and to ourselves and others. Why do you think there hasn't been to date more of a focus on how to do social ecology?
Yeah, that's quite a question. I wish I had a little bit more time to put my mind to it, because it's such an important question. And I think there are many reasons contributing to what in many ways is a replication of the divide between nature and society, right? That ultimately it's a conceptual divide, and what we see in movements are initiatives that consider themselves ecological and that are oriented towards working with the land, working with non-human beings, gardening, agroecology. I use the word permaculture in the book, but if I could go back and do it again, I would say agroecology, which is a much broader range of practices, and I think that's a more apt word. So you sort of, on the one hand, you have people who are doing agroecology and restoration, conservation, and to a certain extent, defense and campaigns like pipeline defense. And then on the other hand, you have the political activists who are really excited about direct democracy and the politics of it and the principle of federation as an answer to historical problems relating to the state and authoritarianism and the Marxist-Leninist model of vanguard cadre organizing. And so we've recreated that dualism. And the question of why we've recreated that dualism, again, I think ask for very complex thinking, that's such a rich area to look into. Off the top of my head, I think, one is just we carry around that duality with us. Another, I think, has to do with access to land and the commodification of nature that we've seen in the last 40 years. When Bookchin was formulating social ecology, and there were early efforts at the Institute for Social Ecology, and that was tied into the Back to Land movement in the 1970s and 80s. Land wasn't as remotely as expensive as it is now. And so I see in my own organizing that there's a massive generational divide between folks who have a focus on the ecological nature, land, material aspects of social ecological practice, and then the political. Young people don't have access to land. And our movements are largely urban movements. And another contributing factor, so this is why I asked earlier about, hopefully we can edit some of this out, but this is why I asked earlier about the timing, because I can go on about these questions and topics. But I think another significant contribution is that our movements are often still limited in their imagination about what we can do in cities. And we're often fighting for example, like tenants' rights, which is itself like an impossible task, or is a very, very ambitious goal considering the context that we're in. And yet, for the politics to work, we have to have massive material changes as well. And in the United States, this takes a real extreme because our material reality is entirely shaped by cars and strip malls, and we live in this incredibly unlivable, inhuman environment. And so when you talk about direct democracy here, people look at you like you're crazy because you can live 5 minutes away from someone and not be able to walk to their house because it's completely cut up by freeways. And so when it comes to activism and really trying to make changes today, our urban movements do sometimes become limited in our thinking about what's possible, because to really achieve the material and physical and social conditions for social ecology and direct democracy and federal politics, we need massive material changes in how people live. We need walkable cities. We need food production locally. We need local autonomy, community production. All of these kinds of material elements are necessary as well. So the bar gets set even higher. So I think that's another contributing factor to how we've accidentally recreated the binary of nature and society in activism.
I would like to ask you how you got interested and involved in social ecology. I mean, there is all this landscape of tendencies within the libertarian and anarchist landscape. What won you on these ideas and how you got engaged with that? Because we know that social ecology is not like a mainstream tendency, and neither it is in Europe. So it's interesting for me how people like you, me, and Krini, we got engaged with these ideas and we promote them.
Yeah. So for me, it really was kind of an accident. I had just graduated from undergrad. I was studying philosophy. I had had exposure through my philosophy degree to some anarchist arguments. Actually, by accident, I had a philosophy professor who gave it to us really as a joke, like, an article by an anarchist, I believe his name's Eric Wolf, who wrote about the state and undermining and how the principles of the social contract and the justification for the state really kind of undermine themselves. And I remember thinking, oh, that's actually a really good argument. But even before that, as a young person, I had witnessed aspects of the anti-globalization movement in Washington, D.C., mobilizations against Coca-Cola, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. I had witnessed those things as a young person. So in some ways, I was already seeing the impacts of social ecology without realizing it. And then after I graduated school, I was unemployed. I was sort of searching for what would come next in my life. This was economic depression, really, like the height of the 2010 economic depression here in the United States. Or, I mean, it was worldwide, but certainly, that was very much going on in my life. And I found myself helping out in the home of a social ecologist in Western Massachusetts, Haya Heller, and I was helping to look after her son and helping walk her dog, and I started talking with her about politics, and she had Murray Bookchin's books in her home, and she had been mentored by him directly. And I was absolutely fascinated by Bookchin's writing. She had a copy of Remaking Society in her basement, and when I was done babysitting, after I would sit on the couch and read it, and I would go, "Oh my God, this is incredible!" And then she was running a study group at the time that I joined, and then a few months later, Occupy Wall Street happened, and it's hard to convey how shocking and awe-inspiring that moment was, to have been reading about direct democracy and popular assemblies, having no exposure to the concept before, and then suddenly to see thousands of people participating in them all over the world. So I went to New York City. I got very involved in Occupy Wall Street, and that was just sort of it for me. Like, my whole life changed from that moment, and it's hard to imagine it ever going back. That was probably the most pivotal moment of my life in September 2011.
And so for this book, was this part of your doctoral research from your PhD, or was it a separate side project? Can you tell us a little bit about how that kind of project developed, and the places it took you, the questions you had, and the places it took you to?
Yeah. So there are absolutely elements of my doctoral work in this book, and I submitted it as a chapter of my doctorate. I had other elements in my doctorate as well, but the book was sort of put in there as a part of it. And the elements that really start to get into my doctoral work have to do with the Kurdish movement, and particularly the Kurdish movement in Europe, from whom I've learned so much while doing doctoral research. I'd also done research in Barcelona and had exposure to the municipalist movement there and gotten to know some of those debates. I also had the opportunity to spend time at Can Masdeu, which is an eco-village in the hillsides of Barcelona, which appears in the book. So there's sort of like all of these very disparate kind of experiences that I was having while conducting research, but I found were not legible in the conceptual vocabulary of the academy. Like, I had no way to really talk about the network of movements and ideas that were circulating around social ecology that I was seeing internationally. So with the book, I really started with the ideas and the theory, and then moved into the practices and looking at how all of these different practices are tied together by the theory and the sensibility and the philosophy and the perspective. And so the book really draws on those elements, but it's not an academic text in the sense of beginning from anthropological argument and then investigating ethnographically and going back and drawing theory from the ethnography. It's really not an academic text in that sense. And I was really lucky to have a supportive advisor who allowed me to do this work. And in some ways, this book is really a product of COVID-19. I was in the midst of my ethnographic research. I was in London, working with the Kurdish Assembly there when the pandemic hit. And all of a sudden, overnight, like everything that I was looking at evaporated. I really wanted to explore the assemblies there in more depth and understand sort of how they work. I think at the time, theoretically, I was looking at like linguistic theory and sort of looking at assemblies as communication events. And it all evaporated overnight because of the pandemic. And then this is a long story, but I was living in Italy at the time. I was married to an Italian, and so I went back to Italy, spent the pandemic in Italy, and at a certain point, I just said, you know what? This is a book that I really want to write. I had a connection to Pluto Press, who've also been really great and supportive. And I just thought, you know what? I'm going to see if I can start the book and then go back to my advisor and say, hey, this is what I want to do. Will you accept this? So that's kind of what I did. I got a book contract. And then I went to my advisor and I said, hey, look, I have a book contract. Will you accept this as my doctorate? And she said, this is wonderful. I'll accept it as part of your doctorate, and then we'll do some other pieces to that are more focused on academic argumentation, more focused on contemporary anthropological literature. And it worked out great. And I was able to do that. And again, I was really lucky to have a wonderful advisor. Her name's Jacqueline Erla. She writes about Basque language activism in the Basque country, and she's just great. So I got lucky.
I was going to ask. So you're in the States. You talked a little bit about your experience there, and you go to do this research looking through the double lens of an activist and an anthropologist. So, I mean, just out of curiosity, I know that you mentioned in the book that, and I said at the beginning as well, acknowledging it, that social ecology is a lot more than just assemblies. But from your particular point of view, when you saw them, and I maybe participated as well, if I'm correct, right? And you did your research, what did that dual lens, what did that perspective lead you to focus on? Or what did you see and experience that I think is important for people to know?
I think it's hard to imagine approaching any kind of activism as an object of study as purely an anthropologist or a researcher. That notion, I think, it's very strange to me. I think it's very strange to many people. You're not really seeing or observing anything if you're not actively involved, right? You're not actually, you're not accurately seeing what's in front of you if you're not taking seriously that we are all implicated by movement and the need to change this world in some way. So the notion of a dispassionate observer is a colonialist, patriarchal, erroneous construct. So there's no way I could have done or seen any of the things that I did if I weren't an activist first. That was always my perspective. And it made my time to degree very long. I'll say that, like all of my peers in my program, like they got awards or they got jobs or they got research fellowships. And I was always sort of broke and like really having to piece things together, and was not very legible to faculty or academic anthropology because I was doing this very different kind of work. And I don't know, the academy is such a contradictory and complicated place to be, because I think that on the one hand, when activist anthropologists get successful, people really celebrate them, right? Graeber talked about this all the time, that like, people celebrate him now, but he often had a lack of support from the academic establishment. I also think it made in some ways, the investigation more complex because I did a lot of work and writing and, editing, compiling newsletters and digests and things like that, and simply just going and being present for demonstrations or just spending time with people. But it's a epistemically messy and sort of complicated space to occupy, because the scholarship always felt like it sort of came later, and just being a human being in space with people is what I hope came first. That's what for me always came first. Now I feel like it's also gotten more complex because I have the book. It's successful. I'm over here, but Rojava is still struggling. I don't want to assume that my role has been entirely positive, because I'm even questioning that now. But I think the human to human connection is what matters the most in any sort of investigation. And I think the Academy is slowly sort of coming around to that.
Thank you for answering that, because, with everything that's been happening in the world and in Greece in particular, where Yavor and I live, lots of people are writing about things that they don't really participate in, and they're taking kind of like a bird's eye view of things. And I think it's a completely different perspective to hear somebody or to read someone who writes about the actual experience of being there, whether they're doing it as a political activist or just an anthropologist and an activist as well. So yeah, thank you for saying that. Also, like at the Transnational Institute of Social Ecology, I think most of us identify with that space of coming from some kind of scholarly background, but really thinking of ourselves as activists first, who want to write on the basis of our experiences and participation. Yavor, sorry, you wanted to.
Yeah, also I agree with what both of you were saying, and this was also one of the characteristic traits of Tris's conferences so far. I mean, there is this political focus, that there is a political project that is being discussed by people that actually are concerned about these issues and that they participate in movements. So, for me personally as well, this is my major concern, that we actually discuss what we as people can do to come together as communities and to articulate coherent projects. And because the book that we discuss now places also a lot of focus on the Rojava philosophy and practice. And I think this is very important, because there is, until recently, there was not enough information. And also many people are still carrying this old information of what the Kurdish freedom movement stands for, even until today. And it's good that there are such books that come to illuminate this very significant and important shift and the paradigm that the Kurdish freedom movement has offered for the Middle East, because this is very important amidst this warmongering there and all the massacres and genocides that are taking place there. So it's very important what the Kurdish movement has to offer. And also that the Kurdish people are not a monolith. We have to bear this in mind. There are many tendencies, and it's important that even in the title of the book signifies which tendency we speak of: the one that promotes democratic modernity and democratic confederalism, the one that is actually building these things into practice in Rojava, in the northeast Syria. So I would like to ask about your involvement with the Kurdish movement, and also your commentary on the recent developments within this specific tendency, the call of Öcalan for the PKK to disarm and disband itself. I know this because also there has been a lot of misinterpretation, according to me, that was circulating the internet. Like, people are not really sure what is going on. Many of people say that, okay, the Kurdish people are like giving up and leaving the initiative on Turkey. So all these things, just to get your perspective.
Before I answer that, I want to say quickly about the last topic, and and research, I think it's a question of loyalty and where your loyalties lie. If you have a loyalty to the university and the institutions of the university that provide protections, but ask you to focus on really trivial matters, even if they seem interesting, but as we all know, like they ask you to focus on criticism when what we really need is to look at alternatives. I think really that's what it sort of comes down to, that the word love, where your loyalties lie, sort of came up to me. Okay, so on the question of my involvement now with Rojava and the Kurdish freedom movement and my perspective on the recent development, I can say that my involvement in the Kurdish movement since I moved back to the United States now, I think about 3 years ago, has not been nearly as robust or direct as when I was living in Europe, and when I was doing the work that went into this book. I felt kind of cut off, in part because people leave the region, they go to and from the region. The violence has driven away a lot of the connections that I made in 2016, 2017, 2018. Now by 2022, 2023, people have, gone on to Europe, or they've moved on to other projects in their lives. I've maintained contact with a few folks in the region, and my understanding is that the situation there is very challenging on a practical level. Like, their concerns are about getting water for crops, getting water for people. Their concern is to meet people's basic needs. Turkey continues to bomb critical infrastructure. So they're in a position of having to really focus on the crisis at hand. At the same time, many of the social experiments have become more robust. Like, if you look at Jinwar, the women's eco-village, they continue to grow and have more efforts. But the international support that was happening and, really sort of reaching a peak around 2017, 2018, I think that wave has rolled back, and I've been caught up in that as well. It's a real challenge to support the region, especially because of the embargo, and especially because of the bombing and the difficulty of getting supplies to the region. So my role has been really talking about Rojava here in the United States and continuing to spread the word, continuing to follow what's going on in Rojava, supporting campaigns for their very real immediate needs. But also, I've found myself personally, as fascism has truly taken over the United States, that my focus has been really here and on my neighbors, and trying to build democratic confederalism in the United States in a real way. And by that, I mean not just sort of abstractly like talking about democratic confederalism, but like working with my neighbors, helping activists and various places build out popular assemblies. We're very quickly following the Middle East into a violent life or death conflict. So in many ways, it's felt like the Kurdish struggle has come to the United States, in the sense of we are mobilizing for self-defense. and mobilizing to protect the diversity of peoples here. So I don't know if that is going to translate into a satisfying piece of the podcast. But it's a very challenging moment. It's like in particular, like the challenges of life here in the United States has in some ways taken over. Certainly my sense of urgency. And then on the recent developments with the dissolution of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, I don't have special insight to provide into that. Although, in my opinion, I think that the maneuver has already in some ways been successful, because it was, on one level, an attempt to shift the global narrative about the Kurdish question in Turkey. And it was a major point of pressure placed onto Erdogan to follow through with some of his commitments and to honor some of his agreements, for the PKK to put down their arms and say, look, we're here for a political solution. What will you do? How will you respond? I think this puts tremendous pressure on Erdogan, and you're already starting to see it in policy discussions and international relations forums and things like that. What is left of the international community really has absorbed this, and is looking to Erdogan to say, okay, what will you do? So it's a risk. We all know it's a risk, but every path entails risks. So I think that in some ways it's already been successful. And it's also clear that energy must go to the democratic autonomous region in northern Syria, that there must be resources, people, and energy effort going towards Rojava right now because of the newly empowered regime in Damascus and with the emboldening of ISIS. So unfortunately, I don't have special insight on the situation now, more so than anyone else who loves and supports the movement. I believe in the wisdom of the movement, though.
If you don't mind, I'd like to go back to what you were saying about in the United States and the work that you're doing there with assemblies. So in your book, you said something really interesting, which I think has been the experience of many of us. But you say it's one thing to advocate and participate in direct democracy, and another to be mentally and emotionally prepared for it. So I guess I'm asking, on the basis of your experience and your research within the different places you were in the world, like, what were those obstacles? And at this really crucial moment in time, what can we do to get past them? And like, what are people doing in the States to get past them?
That's okay. Yeah, we can certainly get to a couple of those themes or come back to them. I mean, on that point of, it's one thing to advocate for direct democracy and another to participate in it, and to be prepared to succeed. I think that insight certainly comes from engaging with Kurdish activists and seeing just how different overall their attitudes and mentalities are towards organizing. And after spending a lot of time with folks, it really became clear to me that the difference between how successful their movement has been and ours isn't so much the level of organization or the kind of organization. I think I write about this in the book, right? That we imagine that it's a formula, and if you just get the formula right, everything will sort of click into place. But in my observation, that really wasn't the case at all. It was about people's attitudes towards each other, and about their like patience and resilience. So I actually wrote some thoughts in an answer to this question that you had wrote me, and I think it's something I think I might try to write about a little bit more. But I said, direct democracy is often hindered by the fact that its champions lack the social skills necessary to succeed in the very participatory systems they advocate for. That is, they lack the capacity for self-criticism, they lack humor, patience, grace, they don't know how to listen deeply. And these are, of course, feminized skills and habits. So it's no surprise that they would be devalued in a patriarchal world. So I go on, but one word that I came up for this that I can't remember if I used it in the book or not, but to me, it's sort of the notion of democratic literacy. That there's this language of how to be in deliberation and communication and negotiation and collaboration with people who might think very differently than you. And to be able to do that, you have to have a lot of patience. You have to have a lot of social or emotional self-regulation. Like, you can't be emotionally reactive. You have to be able to select your own response to situations, which isn't to say that you should just lay back and do nothing, or let people trample all over you or trample over each other, but to be able to select your response to situations as opposed to react instinctively. It takes, again, the capacity for deep listening. And that meaning that, like, if you're in a meeting or an assembly, you're not just waiting for your own turn to speak, that you're really listening to the feelings and the motivations, that you're empathizing with those feelings and motivations, even if you disagree with them. And then when you're listening and it is your turn to speak, you're saying something different because of what they said, or being able to suspend judgment, and I say that from my own personal journey as someone who can be very quick to judge and harsh in my judgments and very convinced of my own righteousness, or be very convinced that I'm right, and then to later find out that I'm not right. Those are muscles that we have to exercise, and people who are brought up and socialized to be women in our society are taught them at a very young age, to the point where it almost seems natural, right? The being accommodating, being considerate, trying to find solutions that work for everyone. And so the fact that these mental and emotional skills are naturalized, they're seen as inherent to someone's personality, and they're also seen as kind of secondary to organizing, to the structure of the project itself, or the procedures of voting, I think is actually really erroneous. Because what I've seen in movements, and this is not just related to, research or the Kurdish movement in particular, but in my experience overall, some movements can be very disorganized, actually. They can be really disorganized and not have a lot of infrastructure, not have a lot of procedures, not have an agenda, not take notes, not do all of these things. But because the people are very tightly knit with each other, they have a high degree of trust. They have a high degree of patience with one another. They care about each other deeply, and they have a shared sense of mission. And there's a joy in working together. And the work is worth doing for its own sake rather than some abstract outcome. They do it because they love it. Those movements are often very successful relative to movements that I've experienced, back home, where we have this kind of fetishization around the material, what I would think of as the material sort of architecture of movements, right? Like we have, like here in the United States, it's like we have so many toolkits and training exercises and flowcharts. There's a lot of crossover between business management schemes and tools and things that you would literally learn in a business school and organizing. It's kind of creepy, actually. And what it is it's a cargo cult for capitalism. So for folks who might be listening and don't know what a cargo cult is, a cargo cult is a sort of a term that refers back to certain tribes in Polynesia in the 1950s when they were being colonized. They encountered planes for the first time, and these small, single propeller planes would land on the islands, bringing white people, bringing guns, bringing all of the trappings of capitalism. And as these people saw their way of life deteriorate more and more, some of them built these model planes like out of straw, and they would pray to these planes that they constructed, believing that there were magical powers in these colonists, and that what they had done was to harness this magical power. So in the context of movements, I think we often have this kind of attitude towards the notion that we just have to get the procedures right in order to make that magic happen. But what it actually is about building relationships.
I just want to ask one question about that, or see what you think about this. But from my own experience, especially in the period of kind of demobilization, let's put it that way, that happened in Greece, and this is both from my personal experience and just from informal chats with people and with some research that I'm doing, but I keep on getting the sense that people don't really think that much or that highly of humanity in general. And people have almost said to me, like, these things are great, social ecology, assemblies, the whatever, but it's only some of us that can do them. That it's only some of this that can do them sustainably because we're special. I mean, they don't say it like that. And that the large number, or the largest part of the population is not just indifferent, but I guess, like they're like essentially far right, they're evil, they don't care. And it's kind of really weird to me because I'm thinking, why would you try to do anything if that's what you thought about most people, except for your people, or kind of like your group or your network? Does that resonate with you? Is that something that maybe you've come across or felt?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in the United States right now, half of our country is insane, and they're supporting the Holocaust. They're in a very, they're supporting genocide, not just in Gaza. They're supporting genocide here, and against their neighbors, against the people who cook their food, against the people who care for their children, against the people who grow their food, against the people who sell it, who give them their food in the grocery store. It's despicable. And yet it's an obligation to believe that we can do better, to expect that we can do better. And the attitude on the left that, oh, just some people are too far gone, or not just even some people. I mean, I think there's also a difference between sort of, we know that these people are too far gone. They have, again, like they've actively supporting a genocide against their neighbors, and just that general sense of, oh, most people suck, but we're capable of doing it. It's a moral failing. And I think also many of those people, when you start to talk to them about, okay, well, who are those ordinary people in your life? There's a lot of deep pain. So from my own experience in places like Italy and Catalonia and the Basque Country, like, there are a lot of sort of very chauvinistic anarchists who just want their social center, and they just want to do their thing at their social center, and they don't care about what's happening in politics, right? They say, oh, that's just politics. And they're very lucky to have those social centers. In the United States, we don't have social centers. If you squat a building here, you immediately get an AR-17 in your face. You get a gun pointed at you. And so it's actually a kind of privilege. There's like that you're in a part of the world where you can even have something like a left. But I think when you talk to those people, at least in my experience, they're alienated from their families. They're alienated from the neighborhoods that they grew up in, and they kind of just want to like push it all away. So in some ways, like, that's the inflection point, is the communal relationships and the bonds. And at least in my experience, there's a tremendous amount of hurt and suffering that is going on in European families. And I think this goes back to really taking feminism seriously as a global issue, and it's not just about women or violence against women. It's about a paradigm of how we relate to each other, and actually, even in comparison to the United States, like the United States obviously has tons and tons of problems, but like as a USian, as an American who's lived in particularly in Southern Europe, like, it is shocking how much violence is going on in families in Europe. And so I think that is part of where that very kind of chauvinistic attitude, this like walled off kind of attitude, comes from. And I have to say, when you interact with Kurdish activists, or I also saw this in the Basque Country, people tend to have better relationships with their family. Like families organized together. You have whole families that are political, siblings, parents, aunts and uncles, cousins. And that communal, the communal aspect of it, I think is actually really crucial. And again, looking across ages, like old folks and young folks, like not just dismissing the old and not just dismissing the very young, like the revolution is not just for able-bodied 24-year-old men. And I think every revolutionary movement has taken that seriously. And it's unfortunate that the left does not take it seriously. But you look at the Zapatistas, or you look at indigenous movements of the MST in Brazil, like they have people from every age group, every walk of life is participating. Raul Zabetchi, I'm sure I'm butchering his name, calls it a society in movement as opposed to a social movement. So what we're looking for is not a social movement, meaning a minority within the politically dominant group, but we're looking for a society and movement where there's whole, there's the fabric, the fabric of life is moving in a more integrated and coherent and humanistic direction. So that's what we want. And there's a lot of, I think, kind of immature ideas about what it means to be political that we kind of have to put away. It's not just hanging out in the squat and, having a show and drinking beer. All of those things are really important and really great, but also we're not a left if we're just doing that and leaving behind ordinary people.
I would like to add here that I think that what you describe, it's one, in my opinion, one of the strongest points of social ecology, of the theory of social ecology. I mean, Bookchin was very vocal about this, that if you really strive to change society, you have to get the great majority of society on your side, because this is not something that you can impose. Direct democracy is not something that an elite will impose, and otherwise Venezuelan experiment was going to work. It's not something, or the October Revolution was not going to deteriorate to this degree that history have shown. So you really have to go out there and not to be afraid of your neighbors. You have to go and speak with people. You have to try to organize the old, the young, everyone, men, female, trans people. Everyone should be part of this. There is no other way around, and that's why I like very much the examples that you point, because in Zapatistas, in parts of Kurdistan that there is autonomy, I mean, everyone participates. Otherwise, it just deteriorates and it turns into a dictatorship, a type of tyranny. That if you remember, Muammar Gaddafi was speaking about direct democracy, but there were tanks marching in the streets. I mean, if it's going to be thriving and resilient democratic community, it has to involve everyone. Most of the people have to have this passion for politics, So I think that what you describe is very good, a capturing of the essence of social ecological theory.
I also think that your book is really good at showing that these things are possible, because I think that's another thing which kind of I find striking, and I'm sure lots of people do, that people really connect with the theory, people really understand it or are starting to. But then if you ask them, do you think this is possible, or why don't we try to do it? They really struggle to believe that it is. So I think hearing about the examples that you give in your book is really, really important for people to see that it's not just something that can happen in the future. These are things happening now. So I guess to these people then, I would ask you, on the basis of your experience, what would you say to people? How do we speak to those people? That's not just what would you say? I guess I'm asking, what could I say to, or what could we say as the Institute of Social Ecology?
Yeah, that is such a tough question. I feel like it depends on how. No, it's fine. I've thought about it a lot. It kind of depends on how I'm feeling. My initial reaction is I don't have anything to say to them, especially right now. Again, I'm coming out of meetings with my compatriots who are afraid to go outside, and we're trying to figure out okay, how can we help people who are afraid to go outside, but also what meaningful protection can we provide? And, I find myself going back to sob stories in the United States a lot, but it's just what's on my mind, or here in the United States today, 50 people at least got swept away in floods in Texas, because the National Weather Service is no longer they're no longer having accurate, up-to-date warnings. And most of the people who were swept away were children at summer camp. And so in my mind, I'm okay, so to people who are oh, this sounds great, but, could it really work? I'm do you have any better ideas? What, I'm I don't have anything to say to those people. I'm it's because it's like in my reality right now, it's like there are people who give a shit and who care about life. Like it's become very black and white. And this is, I think, part of what I mean with, like, in some ways, I feel like the war-like reality of Rojava has come to the United States, in the sense of, like, the lines now ideologically are like, do you believe that people should live? Do you believe that families should stay together? Do you believe that we should care about the planet and the world and our ecology? Do you care about life, or do you believe in death? It's like, it's become very black and white. And so
necropolitical.
Yeah. Sorry, what was that?
The necropolitics is what it's.
Exactly. It's become necropolitics. It's really a paradigm of life and death. And, and there are people in the death cult who say, they even call themselves pro-life, right? And, there's lots of dark details, I can go into about that, but it's just like, I can't even, just on a personal level, I can't even stomach it anymore. I'm like, you're just lying. You're not pro-life. You're in a death cult. Like, and I just don't have time to argue or to try to convince you. And so for the people who believe in life, right? Because I think you are speaking to people who are like, oh, these ideas sound great, but could we ever really do them?
To potential allies, to potential, not to the ones who are on the side of death, but, and the things I was saying before, I really had in mind potential allies, people who at least seem to be friendly to the ideas and the goals and the transformations. Yeah.
But I still kind of have a similar attitude of like, okay, well, what are you proposing that's better? Because we have an obligation right now to propose. We have to find something. Like, okay, maybe it's not pure federal direct democracy, like a la Bookchin, but like, do you believe people have a right to participate in governing themselves in their own towns? Like, do you think we need to move towards sustainable energy? Okay, then what do you actually propose for this? And to me, it's very clear that the paradigm of neoliberalism is dead. It never had much to offer, but I think when people parrot we just need to elect the right politicians again. Like I have that same kind of disbelief of like, you can't be serious, that we'll just go back. We'll turn the clock back. You do see a lot of this conversation right now. We just need to go back to the way it was before Trump, and it's like, well, what was there before Trump? There was Bush. What was there before Bush? There was Clinton. And what was there before Clinton? There was Reagan. Like, so, I mean, that's my initial reaction, is like, I'm much more interested in there are enough of working with people of whom, at least where I am now, there's quite a lot who are ready to think in bigger picture terms. So I've been really lucky in that sense, that there's been a big shift here of people who are like really ready to start thinking about real alternatives and real transformation. But if I'm thinking about being, like really more diplomatic or speaking, again, maybe speaking to sort of European audiences where like things aren't quite so black and white. I think it's like, well, sure, this kind of transformation has never been done before, but anything that happens from now has never happened before, right? Like, we're in an unprecedented historical situation and moment, and we really are in a position of inventing the future. Like, there's no reliable system from the past that's going to sustain us through what comes next. It's maybe a little cheesy, but but Murray Bookchin has that quote, we have to do the impossible or face the unthinkable. Like, sometimes that can feel abstract, but it is very real and immediate that we have to truly do something new, or what happens is unthinkable. And in the United States, I feel like the unthinkable is already happening. Even the things that are happening 2 days ago were unthinkable last week, which were unthinkable a month ago. And the things that are happening a month ago were unthinkable 6 months ago, which was unthinkable a year ago. Like, things can change so rapidly. But yeah, no, and then I feel like I'm not answering this in quite the way that I want to. I mean, there's also, like pointing to examples. Like, that's why I wrote the book. I wrote the book so that people who were like, oh, these ideas are great, but how do you practice this? I was like, okay, here's how people have practiced this. And here's how people have practiced it in different kinds of situations. But it's funny how when you talk about these ideas with Indigenous people, you don't have that question of like, oh, is this really possible? What you actually get is like, oh yeah, no, we've been doing that for thousands of years, and you people came and fucked it up. Like, they're just like, leave us alone. That can exist if you just leave us alone and stop logging on our land. So yeah, I don't know. I guess it also kind of depends on the person too, right? Like, I mean, I don't know. It's crazy because people will watch movies and television of like heroic, revolutionaries doing incredible things, and they love it. But then they step away from their televisions and believe that it's not possible.
Or it used to be like in film and media studies, how the world is saved by the one special individual, never by the community, right? Never by people working together. It's always that one hero that's going to do it, And so I think many people kind of keep that template in their mind, even in activism, that, okay, sure, there's a community, but it's going to take that one or those few special people with special capacities and special resilience and ability to be able to do something. I think that's so hardwired in some people.
And I think there's a real understandable human desire to retreat into the comfort that you have, and I can't help but put on my map of making generalizations about the United States and Europe. And you're very broad, but let's say Southern Europe is like, I see that people want to sort of say like, and like drink on the terrazza and like have their, like Sunday meal with their family, and like we have this little bit of peace over the last, that's like after the post-war period, there's this little bit of peace, and we can just maintain it if we just, if we just keep doing what we do, but the ice is melting, and it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And that at a certain point, there's no, that it can disappear. And it's a very human reaction because we're conservative in our thinking. Like, if we assume that what is here is going to always be, and I put myself in this too, right? That it's like, you think you're going to have those comforts, but then they absolutely can be taken away very, very quickly. And that's where I do think you see differences in attitudes between people in the global South or in places like Rojava, where they really don't have that sense of comfort, that we can just go and retreat into our homes. Like, you have to struggle. And you don't even really get a choice in it. There's something else, gosh, that it's kind of slipping from my mind about this question, but maybe we'll get back to it.
So I was just thinking that as you were speaking, that probably the thing that popped out the most about social ecology and about the how-to thing is to start with relationships. I mean, you basically say that social ecology at its core is and direct democracy is how we treat each other. And I find that again, I mean, I've been in situations in activist education where people really are looking for the tool. People really are looking for the template. And if you say, we have to start with relationships and that's the core of it all, they kind of get stressed. They kind of get anxious because they're like, what do you mean we have to start with relationships? And, it's at the core of social ecology. But for example, in the States, there are also very famous organizers like Marshall Gans who said that. Who said, organizing, building movements is 100% about relationships. So I guess that maybe for many of us in the West, because of, the toxicity of capitalist culture with all the racism, sexism, patriarchy, and everything that goes with it, sometimes people hear relationships and they're thinking about the toxic ones, because I think right now, I mean, it's just everywhere to hear about how difficult relationships have become for many people in the workplace, in families where there's a lot of trauma and violence and other things. So it seems to me that, the way that social ecology articulates the idea of relating to the extent that it involves care, relational care, as you put it, which it does, I think is really, really important to working towards these transformations that just seem so daunting now.
Yeah. And when you bring it up in many activist spaces, people get anxious and others get angry or frustrated because they feel like you're talking about something that's trivial and taken for granted and doesn't require real work. They think you're talking about singing Kumbaya and hugging each other and patting each other on the back, and then you all just go home, But then it's those same people who poo-poo relationships who then struggle to organize campaigns that actually bring in diverse communities, or they can't organize a program that has more than just white men, and this is what I encountered again and again. So actually my emphasis there in the book comes from my own experience of being told again and again that this was secondary and trivial, when my eyes and ears were telling me that it was actually central. And that, and fortunately, I've been so blessed to be able to see assemblies and to travel, and see many different movements and see that actually the democratic politics that we're talking about, the assembly politics that we're talking about, don't function without them. They just don't. And I said this in the book, every experienced organizer will tell you that like they don't, the internal work, right? Like if you just try to have assemblies in a neighborhood, like don't expect anything out of it. Like, sure, you can have an assembly and that will, maybe get people used to talking and there'll be excitement, but like, that's not going to be a functional space without the relationships, without the understanding, and without years of work. That's many people told me that, 10, 15 years is what it takes, right? And you see that, with the PYD, they took 10, 15 years of going door to door, not like literally going village to village, door to door, talking with every single family multiple times, and they didn't hand people pamphlets. They talked to them and they listened. And that's the most important thing, right? Because people want to feel heard. So actually, maybe that's the right answer to the people who are like, oh, this sounds good, but I don't think it could ever work. Maybe the answer is actually to say, well, why do you think that? And then they'll go, well, I saw this and this and this. And then you can go, oh, yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Like, none of this works without social justice. Like many people I've encountered will be kind of like about direct democracy. And they say, why are you so opposed to this? And they'll say, well, if there was direct democracy in the US, like communities of color would potentially be subject to terrible, unthinkable violence. And grassroots democracy in the United States at times has been the vessel of terrible colonial violence. And so that's a reminder that none of these principles function without the other, right? Like direct democracy by itself doesn't really mean much of anything. It has to be brought into harmony with social justice. In the same way that social justice doesn't mean anything. Like we can have rainbow capitalism, we can have a perfect, like racial equity or even gender equity, and we still have systemic exploitation. They have to go together. And I think that that's a part of what, like, people want easy solutions. They want digestible, So for me, the book was about trying to like, okay, I want to make this as simple as possible, but like, it doesn't get much more simple than this. Like, if you're like, okay, I'll meet you halfway and try a publication that can make things simple, but then you need to also, or we all need to come together and realize that this is really a paradigm for life and not just, right, like not just a formula. It's not just consensus processes.
And it comes to show also that there is a specific temporality to one such project. I mean, things does not happen overnight, and this is one of the problems that these people that you refer to, that they're like reluctant to these ideas, that they say, oh, we don't have time to this. This is, can wait after the revolution. And, this is this germ that capitalism has left in the minds of people, even on the left, that they think that things can happen quickly, that there is this like, this sense that we don't have time, we have to do it now, we have to do it quickly, and everything else can wait. We have it also in Greece, and we have it everywhere, also in the Eastern Bloc. Many activists, unfortunately, tend to do that. And some of the most successful examples are exactly the ones that follow what you described, like the Zapatistas, who embrace the pace of the snail, because they're very how to say, conscious that what they try to do requires time, it requires self-education. So self-emancipation is a process of constant self-education. So it cannot happen overnight. It's all of us, we're simultaneously teachers and students. So it's slow-paced.
Oh, I'll just quickly add, and also requires a lot of failure. Like the expectation that we'll just succeed immediately is also very much a part of that.
Yeah. I agree. It's this tendency, this capitalist logic for short-term profit, that you need to do it now. We have to do it quickly, and you have to do it efficiently with zero cost if possible. And this is the exactly opposite of the direct democracy as project that you say. It's not just some procedures, but it's a whole project that encompasses many things. It requires a whole different perception of time, and I think this is very important and very little explored. And I think you touch upon this, even on this subject of relationships. This is very important, because it's not just, like you say, kumbaya, because there is this new age element in movements, that okay, we'll hold hands and we'll sing and everything be good. But the direct democracy that social ecology advocates as a project, it requires something else, also different type of relationship between us as citizens, as stewards, relationships based on equality, of total equality, and not just social justice in the rainbow way that you mentioned, the rainbow capitalist way, but of actual equality, that we, as a starting point, equality is starting point, because often, the left falls in this trap that equality is the end point, where we'll meet. But until there, we can do other things. But the thing is that social ecology puts that we start from equality. This is the starting point. We have to do it every step of the way. It should be framed on the base of equality.
I also think there's something about the capitalist culture that that you've been talking about, both of you, because that's what it is. It's internalizing those norms and values. Like Yavor mentioned efficiency. That's exactly what I was thinking about as well. I think there has to be some kind of, and social ecology can do this. And you do talk about education in your book. But I think there's something about actually defining, what do we mean by equality? What do we mean that, relationships? I mean, people sometimes completely reject the idea that the personal is political. They completely reject the idea that there's any space within political work for things like emotions or things like some kind of personal relationship. They completely reject that. That's so outside of their understanding of what politics is. And they do say, well, what do you mean? We're going to talk. I mean, in Greece, some people say, what do you mean? We're going to do psychotherapy? We have so much work to do. We can't sit here and discuss our problems. So that's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about turning a political group into a psychotherapy group. But I think it is important to explain, what do we mean by that? Because it's just so far removed from people's experience and understanding that it's really important to say, what do we mean? What is that? What does a group look like that when they develop relationships? How do relationships within the work group look like? What do they feel like? What's the experience of it? And I think there's so much that we talk about that is warped, right? Or skewed by capitalist culture, that it ends up looking very different to people and alienating them.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the element of patience and accepting imperfection is one really important linchpin. Like if we were to make a list, right, there's like the expectation of speed and efficiency and everything's going to happen right away. I think also the expectation that we're all supposed to behave according to these principles all the time, and we're never supposed to make mistakes or you're out. And having patience with each other, being annoying or being flawed, like that is a part of what we're trying to achieve, while at the same time not tolerating really egregious behavior, because there's this kind of paradoxical relationship where I feel like movements will have this expectation of kind of like a purity of your views and your stance and your analysis and your behavior. And then at the same time, there'll be monsters in our midst and there'll be real abuse happening. And then, but that's so scary that people will say like, well, that's not right. That's personal. That's a personal issue. Or when those cases are raised, whole entire organizations are utterly blown up. I mean, there are paradigms for this. And I know I mentioned a few of them in the book, but there's all kinds of projects for like transformative justice, restorative justice, and that's sort of, how do you maintain a community in the face of antisocial behavior, like real antisocial behavior. But on the sort of the microscopic level on movements, just like in terms of people's attitude, I think there needs to be a lot more acceptance for patience, for imperfection, so again, especially if we're expecting to work with people who have very different views than we do. And I think this also sort of gets into like having some acceptance for different kinds of organizing, different kinds of projects. Like a lot of the work that I do locally, like if you were just to look at it on paper or look at it on a website, it looks very liberal and kind of, it's not very radical, but these are the people in my community. And actually, once you start to talk with them, you realize that they have good things going on. Like we have a lot of local churches, they're local Presbyterian churches that are showing a real interest in helping with the housing crisis and potentially like building on their land, so we're looking at projects about having low income housing being built on church property. And, it's like on paper, that's not particularly radical, but like I'm finding as I'm talking with people who have those values and I share my own views, they're curious at first, they go, oh, that's really interesting, and I'm sure they have doubts, in their mind, but it's like But that's the piece about it taking a long time too. Like we can't just expect that people will read one thing or come to one lecture and be convinced. Like it takes time to show people that popular power really is a mechanism to deliver solutions.
Okay, so I think maybe we should leave it here. Yavor, do you have any question or final comment?
No, I think it was very nice discussion. I was very glad that I was part of it, and thank you both of you for your insights and contributions.
I thank you too. Eleanor, it was wonderful having you here on the podcast, and I hope we get to do something like this again soon.
Yeah, this was so much fun. Thank you both so much for having me. Yavor, it's really cool to like talk with you, and I'm just really thrilled to be in collaboration with Teresa, like, and seeing all the really great stuff that you guys are doing right now. Like, it's really important work, and I consider you very important allies.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the kind words. We also consider a valuable ally and a voice of reason.